Hello and welcome to the Friday Five. It's October 14th, and we are going to talk about one Montessori toy, one conventional toy, a practical life idea, a book, and a parenting question that I find on the internet. So, I'm your host, Mariana Bissonette. I am the founder of the Peace Program, the creator of the Montessori Masterclass, and author of Babies Build Toddlers. I am an AMI 0 to 6 Montessori parent coach. I work with families and teachers and schools to support adults who are supporting children during the most critical period of human development. And every Friday, I cover these 5 topics. So let's get started and see what's on the docket today. We are going to talk about our Montessori toy versus a conventional toy. And today, back to back, we have 2 kinds of puzzles that we will take a look at. The first is what would be considered a Montessori puzzle, and the other would be considered just sort of a standard conventional puzzle. Now, when I talk about Montessori toys, I'm always having that distinction that Montessori materials, activities, and toys are created with the child's development in mind. They're not created with the child's entertainment in mind. So, conventional toys are usually designed for the child's entertainment to keep them occupied. That's something that's going to be sort of inherently interesting to them. Montessori, we're also looking for concentration and interest, but we're fostering that through development rather than entertainment. There are, in addition to that sort of basic idea, there are actual Montessori materials that have been created for the Montessori curriculum. And so those would clearly be Montessori toys, but what we talk about in this live stream, it's not always specifically those. So in the example of this puzzle, this would be considered a Montessori material. It's part of the curriculum, and I'm going to explain why. But there might be other things that we can tie a line to the child's development when we think about them, and then that would be under the realm of a Montessori toy. So there's a slight difference with the curriculum, but there's a lot of flexibility that we can see the child's development in the kinds of things we put into their world. So what's up with these 2 puzzles? Well, for one, you'll notice that one has a knob. And the other one doesn't. So if you think about the child's development of their hand, what do we see them doing? Well, in the first 3 months, they have a lot of reflexes in their body and in their hand. So if you, with an infant, if you touch the center of their palm, they're going to close all their fingers around that object or that finger. They are not intentionally grasping things, but they do have that reflex to come around and sort of close their hands around. They also do this with their feet. These reflexes fade over time. And what we start seeing in the next 3 months, so 3 to 6 months, is we see intentional grasping. This is the child reaching out for things intentionally and trying to grasp them. By the time the child is about 6 months old, we see that the child has sort of developed the capacity for intentional grasping. And because they're starting to sit in their gross motor movements instead of just laying on their back, they can start to use their hands more accurately together. So, what do we see after 6 months? Well, we start seeing the fine motor timeline really take off. So, we're moving out of a whole hand grasp, and the child is starting to drop fingers. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that they're getting closer and closer to this, which is called the pincer grasp. This is the kind of grasp that we need to do a lot of detailed work with our hands, and we use our hands regularly every day. If you pay attention to how often you're using a pincer grasp to do something, that will help you understand how important this grasp is, as opposed to trying to do everything as a whole hand. So from 6 to 12 months, we see the child shifting from a whole hand grasp to then maybe using 4 fingers, maybe using 3, all the way down to around 12 months when you see a pincer grasp. So when we think about puzzling for children, Often, when you have a puzzle that has no knobs, how is the child going to pick that up? How would you pick up that piece? Well, you're probably going to use a whole hand grasp, right? Because it's basically like a block. So you're going to use a whole hand grasp. The complexity of this lion puzzle tells me that this is not a puzzle for an infant. This is probably a puzzle for a toddler. But they're well beyond the whole hand grasp that was there from 6 months. So why is their material not refining with the development of the hand? So when you have a knob on the puzzle, now the hand can't use the whole hand grasp. Now we have to actually get down to smaller bits of fingers. So as the child is younger, so this wooden puzzle would probably be somewhere between 12 and 18 months. This particular kind of puzzle is going to have a blocky knob. So that's going to say, we're not going to give them the tiniest knob because they're just now developing strength here. We're going to give it to them where they're probably going to use 3 fingers. But as you go through the Montessori curriculum, you'll start noticing that the child is going to use a smaller and smaller knob as the materials progress through the ages. And that is because we're working on refining and strengthening this part of their grasp. One last thing about the pincer grasp is that by the time the child's about a year, they have this pincer grasp. It's called an inferior pincer grasp. So that's where you have the thumb and the forefinger flat. The proper pincer grasp is when they actually can hold things with the tip of their thumb and forefinger, right? If you can imagine trying to do your zipper just with a flat pincer without the ability to go to the tips, you'll notice that you have a lot less motor capacity. So that's the proper pincer grasp. That's where the hand is going to. So that's one reason why we have the puzzle the way it is. Another reason is, or another sort of way that this puzzling works, is that when we're doing a puzzle, it's not to teach the child a square versus a circle versus a triangle. We're not trying to teach them geometric shapes. But what we are offering them is a slightly different kind of matching activity. Kids do enjoy matching in early toddlerhood and in toddlerhood and even in preschool. Matching tends to be an interesting sensorial experience for them. What is the one version of something, and then how is it alike or different from another version of something? So when they do matching, the puzzle is a version of that matching. So the puzzle actual piece and the puzzle plate would have a match, one being the negative imprint and one being the positive puzzle plate that would fit on top. And so by not having the puzzle pieces right next to each other, we're simplifying the puzzling experience by saying, here's the direct match. Whereas if you give the child a puzzle like the lion, they're probably going to have a much harder time because it's more complicated, because where this puzzle is going to fit is dependent on the other puzzle piece. It's just inherently a more complicated puzzle. So if we want to introduce puzzles to children who are younger, it's helpful if we think through this. Add a chunky knob, have the puzzle pieces separate from one another. The younger version of the puzzle plate on the left actually separates the square from the circle, from the triangle. So it's even isolating it more and more so the child can really work on it. Once the child is older, then they can start using puzzles where the puzzle piece is dependent on its neighboring piece, but that's going to take some time to develop. That's definitely getting much closer to 3 in terms of children really being able to see the imprint as a whole and all the puzzle pieces fitting inside. So those are a couple reasons why Montessori puzzles are set up the way that they are. If you're familiar with Montessori sort of preschool kindergarten, you may have seen the maps, the puzzling maps. You imagine if we're starting with this circle, square, triangle with the chunky knobs and them separate, we're moving towards, for a 3-year-old who would be starting the maps, they would be doing puzzles, but based on continents and countries that they are actually dependent on the neighboring puzzle piece, and the knobs are quite small. All of that is super intentional. Whereas this sort of lion puzzle on the left, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. It's probably more complicated, so it seems like it would be positioned for an older child, but it's not helping their hand grip very much. So then you'd put it younger, and it's all a little bit mixed up. So if you're looking to puzzle with your child, the younger they are, the more isolated the shapes can be, is a really helpful tip. Having a knob is very helpful for the child to continue to refine their hand motion. And then as they get older, going from a single puzzle plate to this one picture, the puzzle plate of 3, to then going into other puzzles where either you're adding more variety but they're all separate, or you're having the same small amount of puzzle pieces like 3, but now they're sort of their edges are connected to another edge, all the way until preschool when they can do pretty large puzzles. This is going to be different than standard sort of adult puzzles. The paper puzzles, those of course are not going to have a knob, but they're thinner. So if a child is really into puzzles, sometimes they're going to get into puzzles in preschool, TK, kindergarten, and we're not sort of going backwards in time with their hand grasp just because it doesn't have a knob. Those ones our hands do have to be more sort of more flexible, stronger, more capable than a chunky puzzle for a younger child. So those ones you were already seeing the child's hand develop, and maybe the puzzle is more of a cognitive task than it is developing their hand. But you can imagine the flat puzzle pieces that maybe adults would use, those ones require more fine motor movements. So that's our Montessori toy versus our non-Montessori toy. We're going to move into our practical life idea. And in our practical life, we're going to consider putting dishes away. When does this practical life idea happen? What could it look like in your household with your child? And when do we start expecting that versus inviting that? So practical life, for those of you who are just listening in and trying to learn a little bit more about Montessori, it's just an idea of the daily living tasks that we all do every day. We all do practical life every day. Every day we have to wash our hands, prepare food, prepare a space to be able to eat the food. We might have to sweep. We might have to wash things like clothes or the floor or the dishes. Then there's going to be a certain way of, once everything's clean, well, now we have to actually like put it back in the location where we know where we're going to find it. That means putting dishes away, putting laundry away, feeding pets, taking care of plants. All of those things are just general daily living tasks that we do every day. So in the timeline of the child's development, they're spending roughly the first 18 months sort of building their basic building blocks of themselves. So they're learning the basics of the language environment that they're in and what language they're supposed to be creating. They're going from no coordinated movement to walking by 18 months. They are moving through a pretty predictable base of creating foundation in the first 18 months. What do you do once you've built a foundation? Well, you're going to want to use it. You're going to want to live and breathe into the skills that you've been creating for the past 18 months. So we see toddlers really wanting to take the reins of their own lived experience. We see them want to do everything themselves. They can get a little adversarial in that way, but you can imagine that it's basically like, they've spent 18 months building a car, like a go-kart. They built it, right? And then to not give them the opportunity to drive it around, it's probably pretty frustrating. So they want to use all the skills that they've built. And they want to do that. Typically, developmentally, they're really focused especially on the daily living skills. So they want to look to their environment and they say, great, I have all these skills now. I want to be independent. What does that mean? I want to make choices for myself, but how do I do that? So typically the toddler is the one who loves practical life activities. This is the time when the child wants to. They want to feed the pet, they want to water the plant, they want to mop the floor, they want to do everything. And if we sort of spend the toddler years finding that sort of rather bothersome or not giving them that opportunity, then we're going to miss a really important window in development when they could have accumulated a way to apply the skills that they've built towards their own independence and ultimately it's the things that help the community, because we don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in isolation. We live in a community. So practical life, the best time to be doing this with your child is going to be in toddlerhood. They are not going to do it perfect, but they do need access to a way to do the things that we all do every day so that by the time they're in preschool, it's second nature. They already know how to sweep up a mess. They already know how to set a table. They already know some basic ways to prepare food. That's not it's not difficult or strange to them. So when we want to elevate the invitation of you could do this to an expectation of you have to do this because it's a chore that everybody contributes to, whether you like it or not, that when we elevate that, it's really helpful if they have the skills to back it up. Because if we say, hey, you're 5, I believe that you can clean up your own mess, or I believe that you can, put your lunch in your bag, or, you're 8 years old, I think you can make your own lunch, or whatever the expectation is. If we want to elevate that, but they haven't built any of the skills, then they're frustrated and we're frustrated. So toddlerhood is like the time to develop these skills. And this one that we're focused on today is putting dishes away. So whether there's a dishwasher or if you're hand washing dishes, whatever the system is in your household, you want to first look at that system and say, what do we do as the adults in the environment? Do we soak the dishes in one basin of the sink and then take turns rinsing them and move them to the other part of the sink and then put them up on a drying rack? Do we just collect them in the sink and then put them into a dishwasher? Like, what is the process here? So the first question is, what is the existing process? Because you can come up with an elaborate sort of Montessori style child-sized kitchen that you set up where they can do all their own dishes and it's all their level. And they're going to want nothing to do with that. Yes, it'll be exciting for a few days, but they don't want to do that. They want to do what you do. That's the whole point in their development, is giving them something that is disconnected from the family rhythm. That's not what they're after. They're after gaining independence in the normal day-to-day of your life. So the first step is going to be, what do I do for this task, for putting dishes away? Are children finding it from a drying rack? Or would they be finding it in a dishwasher? Or are they finding these dishes somewhere else? And that's the first question. The second question is, where do you want them to go? Because if they are on a drying rack, on a counter that the toddler cannot reach, and then they're supposed to be leaving the drying rack and going to a cabinet where they're on the 5th shelf that the toddler cannot reach, then they will have no practice at putting dishes away because the space is not set up for them to do it. And so then they don't practice. And then at a certain point, when they're taller, we say, oh man, I really want you to help with this. 6-year-old, I want you to set the table. I expect that. But then they're so under practice, they don't know where to start because it's not been embedded. But what has been embedded is, you don't do this, I do this for you. So it's really important to think about, what is the situation right now? And then how do we adjust that situation to allow this toddler to be able to do this task? So that could be, instead of storing the plates or whatever equipment you use for meal times that need to be put away, instead of putting them on the 5th shelf, try putting them on the 2nd shelf that the toddler can actually reach. If they can't reach a drying rack because it's up on top of a counter, perhaps there needs to be an added step in the system that you get a wire shopping basket or something like that that goes next to the counter, and you sort of put everything into the basket, and then the child's job is to empty that basket. Or if it's a dishwasher, it's often already at toddler level, but the storage might need to come down. If you have a preschool age child, you still have this really wonderful opportunity to move the child, even if they didn't get a ton of practice in this in toddlerhood. The preschool age child is in a period developmentally of refinement. This is an incredible opportunity for us to be like, oh, we didn't quite get this one. So we didn't quite do this. So we need to like work on having this opportunity. When they're in their elementary years, they will have already learned a habitual of who does what. And if they're under practiced with the sequence of steps, we think it's simple. You pick up a dish, you put it in the cabinet. But we're using a lot of executive functions to be able to do that. We are planning, do I do the dishes first or the utensils? Which one do I start with? We already kind of know which one to start with based on a little calculation. You either start with the one on top, or you start with the biggest ones, or you start with the small ones to get rid of that one tray of utensils. But you have a plan and a system, and then you know where it's supposed to go, probably because you designed that environment of where the plates go, so it makes sense to you. But for the 8-year-old, for a 7-year-old, they're still working on all of those different pieces. And so what we're trying to do in the 0 to 6 time is we're trying to help them out as much as we can by layering in the practice. So if you have a preschool age child and you want to help them put dishes away, first think about what is your system. Second, think about, do they have access? And then think about, this is a time when they are probably, the younger they are, the more interested they're going to be. So if they're closer to 3, we're still in that sort of younger phase where they're pretty interested. If they're 4 or 5, they may not be interested, and that's okay. This is about them having the practice of what goes where. So I would shorten the expectation. I would elevate the expectation, but I would shorten the task. So if you want to have, you say, hey, my 5-year-old, I want to expect them to be able to set the table. Well, why don't you start with having them set their space and give them some anchors? So something in my household that we do is an anchor is the number, the quantity. There should be 5 things at the place setting. So they know that there's supposed to be 5. So if they go to the table and they count placemat, napkin, and that's all they've got, then they're like, okay, I only have 2 things here. What are the other 3? Okay, I can see that there's no water cup. I can see that there's no utensil, and I can see that there's no plate or bowl or whatever we're going to use. So giving the child some anchor points and giving them a smaller task that's still elevated, like, I expect you to set your space and to clear your space, but I'm not going to expect you to set the entire table just yet until you can master this. So putting dishes away can be really helpful. So this is not washing the dishes. This is just getting them back on the shelf. The reverse can be true of getting the dishes out to wherever they're supposed to be. But this hopefully will give you some ideas of ways that you can amend the environment based on the age of your child to be able to support this. So if you have an infant who is in the capacity building phase, they're building the go-kart, then what we really want, what we know is that when they know more about their body, they're able to control that body better. They understand more about the body, right? So if you take a class that's really specific on your legs, and you take an exercise class and you learn all about the legs and you're stretching them in different ways, you're probably going to find muscles that you never really were able to perceive before. And then you're going to be a lot better at whatever the task you're trying to do, the stretch or whatever. Same thing with the child is that in their infancy time, they need a lot of opportunities to just kind of get to know their body and to try to move their body into different places. So allowing the child to have access to their own movements, avoiding limiting their movements as much as possible, and giving them interesting kind of toys where they can develop their hand from that whole hand grasp to the slowly down to the pincer grasp. So all of those can really help in infancy because the more practice they are with their movements in their hand, the more skilled they're going to bring to a task like putting dishes away. All right, let's move on. So we're going to do a book. So this is a book called Grandma's Purse. It's by Vanessa Brantley Newton. And it's just a really sweet book. That's a great book for toddlers. I mean, certainly any picture book can be enjoyed if it's written by an actual author and it's illustrated by an illustrator. These books can be enjoyed by anybody, by adults, children. But I'd say the target age of this, where the story itself is really enjoyable, is going to be toddlerhood. Kids love collections of things in toddlerhood. They're very interested. Certainly by the time they're around 2, they start getting really interested in trinkets and little small objects. And so a bag or a bin of small things inside that they get to discover tends to be pretty interesting to them. And so Grandma's Purse is a really sweet story. So the overall arc of the story is that the grandma always has a purse that she comes with and shares different things with her granddaughter about whatever's in her purse. And it's just a sweet little thing that they do together. And one of the things is a picture of the family, and they get to talk about the family, and some of the other things are trinkets, but it's very toddler forward. This is a really great book for toddlers that they would really enjoy. So Grandma's Purse is a really sweet book. And we're now at our last bit. We're now at our parent question. So here is our parent question of the week. How do I find like-minded, screen-free families to connect with? Is there an age when I should loosen the restrictions up a bit that also won't be to his detriment? Great question. I love questions about screen time. So there's 2 parts to this question. One is about screen time itself, and from an early childhood educator's perspective on what is the arc and trajectory of screen time use, and when does that get loosened up and why. And then the other question is finding other families who are also screen free. I would say to the first question of finding other families, there's 2 sort of routes. One is in the Montessori Masterclass. This is the program that we do at the Peace Program. That's going to give you access to virtual cohorts with families who are joining because they're interested in parenting differently than they were parented. They're joining because they want child development information. They're joining because they're interested in Montessori or have no idea what Montessori is. They're joining because they want to parent super intentionally, or they just don't even know where to start with parenting. And we have live discussions with early childhood educators so you can get answers specific to your family. So it's not like the expectation is not a screen-free space, but we do have the opportunity, if you are interested in being screen-free, is to get support from a community of early childhood educators and other families who are centering development, centering the next generation. And that can be a really helpful space. So check out the Montessori Masterclass. It comes with virtual cohort, self-study, all kinds of things. And definitely screen time comes up, and it's a really good discussion. The second tier of that is likely you're asking about screen-free because you're looking for in-person families. So families near to where you and your kids are, that is going to be a really helpful part, because if your child's friends all have phones at 6 years old or something, then that's going to be more difficult for your child. And it's going to be more difficult for you to actually monitor that, because if your child goes to their house, then it's likely that they're going to be exposed to screen time when you may not want it or when it's not monitored. So I hear the other question of finding screen-free families in your area. I think that it is really a smart thing to do, is to be really mindful of the play dating and all of that. Certainly out at the park, or going outside is a great tool for play dates, because it tends to, it's highly visible, and it tends to really lessen the a reliance on screens as opposed to going to somebody else's home tends to have screens more readily available if that family is not screen free. So I'd say that having outside play dates can be really helpful. And then just having some conversations with people as you get to know them. I mean, nobody's going to be the exact same parent. And I don't think that that's helpful necessarily, right? Like kids need to be exposed to different things, and that's really good for their brain. And it's okay if you make different choices than your parent friends. But I think it's just the being really mindful and intentional around the exposure can be really helpful. But ultimately, once your child is in elementary, I think that it's not about telling them they shouldn't. It's more about helping them navigate a situation if they are. So if somebody, is obviously doing something and showing you something on a device, and we don't have a device, like here's how you could handle that. Make sure to let me know if that ever happens, where they're not getting in trouble, where they don't keep a secret from you, but you're also not blocking them from having friends that just happen to be more device friendly than your household is. I think you'd be cutting off quite a bit of really good friends by not, by sort of like making sure that they're entirely screen free, and we can advocate and support our child and just being able to navigate that situation. It's not wrong. It's about the actual exposure. And if it's helpful, one of the things that I've described to my children, specifically around the internet, not about mobile devices, because I'm not inherently concerned about my child being near or seeing a phone. It's actually about them accessing the internet and accessing things that are not appropriate to them, or that they wouldn't understand, that can actually sort of stick with them. So the way that I've explained it to my kids, I probably had these conversations when they were started around 5 or so. But talking about the internet, that there are places, there are pages, I'm using accurate language, it's pages on the internet, and it's kind of like someone's home. They've designed it, they've decided what's inside. It's like their home. And when you go on the internet, when you open a page or you click on something, it's like you've walked into somebody's home. And then I've placed them back into their sort of concrete experience. I said, in the neighborhood, would you just walk up to any person and just walk into their home? Why not? Oh, you wouldn't even knock on the door? Why not? Well, you don't know them. Okay. And so what is it about them? Like what is it about you don't know them? It's like, well, I'm not sure if it's safe or not. It's like, okay, well, how do you determine it's safe? It's like, oh, well, if you invite me, or if you know the adults and you've told me that that's fine, then we know. I said, exactly. So the internet is the same way, is that each of these pages is like a home, and you wouldn't want to just go into that home because you don't know if it's going to be safe for you or not. And it's really helpful if you get feedback from an adult who can help you understand whether or not that's going to be a space that's safe for you. And that's been a really helpful guidance for them, to not be so sort of on top of them. I mean, they don't do screens. I mean, we watch, movies here and there, but they're not like on the internet. But it's just been a really helpful framing for them, that they are positioned to understand that it's not that it's bad. I use the internet all the time, but it's about getting an adult to help you with it. So if you're at a friend's house and somebody's trying to not have an adult be part of that, then that would be kind of one of those flags. Just say, I think we should maybe ask. My dog has something to say. So the second part of this conversation is going to be, when do you loosen this up? So this is obviously a big contentious topic. So there's a couple different types of screens and screen time. One of them is like the existence of screens, but it's not the content. It's like FaceTime, or having a Zoom meeting with your family and saying hello. That is the least of anyone's concerns. There are some concerns around the backlighting, the blue light of screens that will keep kids awake. They will disrupt sleep. So we do know that. So if you were going to do a FaceTime call or something right before bed, probably not the best option because it actually will affect the child's ability to go to sleep well. And we do care about their sleep in the course of their development. So sleep is something to be aware of, but things that are interactive with family members on the other end, that is the least of our concerns. I would say that toddlers will often do things if they're FaceTiming or connecting with grandma or something. They'll do things like try to feed grandma through the phone. That's because they don't inherently understand what's happening. They don't know what world grandma is living in, and so it's not clear for them what's happening. So I wouldn't do it a ton because there is some lack of awareness of what is reality and what is not. Has grandma like shrunk to this big? Is she in another universe? How come she can't eat if I'm talking to her? So there is some confusion, certainly under 3. So if you were going to do FaceTime, I'd say there's not like any kind of hard and fast, like this is terrible, but I would try to minimize it because I think the experience itself is probably confusing and we don't want the child to stay in a confused, who knows what's real and what's fake kind of space. So that's screen time. The next sort of level of screen time is games. So these are interactive. You're not on the internet. You're not talking about things. It's not like a TV show. It's really just, it seems really simple and it seems easy to sort of pass a baby or a toddler a phone where they can pop bubbles or they can do whatever they're going to do as a little game, and it makes little noises. So the concern with that is the child is interacting with a world that they don't know isn't real. So again, the child has not built a concrete understanding of what the world is until about 3, and they really haven't built it until about 6. So they are concrete sensorial learners from 0 to 6, and that means that they accept the world that is presented to them. So if we infuse in their 0 to 6 experience a lot of expectations around the world that are just not true, then they're going to be quite confused. For example, if on their phone there's a game where, it looks like water and you push it and it makes ripples, that seems like a really not an issue of a game. But if you imagine the child's experience, they're like, this looks like water. I've seen water before. This looks like water. When I push it, it looks like the ripples that I would expect out of water, but my hand is not wet when I push it. And it's hard and immobile. So is that what that's going to become part of the definition of water, is that sometimes water's wet and sometimes water is completely not wet. And sometimes water is liquid that you can go through, and sometimes water is hard and immobile. So we're just adding this completely false definition or experience of water that can be very confusing to the young mind because it's creating a connection that's just not true. And so I would say for that reason, I would not do games for the child, certainly under 3. And I think for 3 to 6-year-olds, they have a better grasp on reality. And then it becomes the third tier of screens, which is entertainment. So it's shows, it's games that they get like sucked into. It's, any kind of media that is sort of grabbing their attention and fixating it. That screens for entertainment, I think we do have to worry about the content. What is the storyline? What is the content? Do the characters name call? Because that's what kids are going to repeat. Are they fighting and aggressive towards one another? That's what kids are going to repeat. So what is the modeled behavior, and are you good with that? What is the speed of that content? A lot of content goes really, really, really fast. So kids are only getting like a third of it and they're not following, and they're just sort of getting zoned in. And when they're zoned in, they tend to sit back and not move as much. So I'd be a little bit concerned with games at that point. In terms of content, though, it becomes a little bit more flexible developmentally, to introduce like really intentional content in the 3 to 6 time frame. You can also go screen free till 6. That would be like sort of the developmental ideal. But, it's also, I'd say that if you're choosing the content really intentionally, for example, if you're choosing to watch Mr. Rogers or something really slow that is short, that is not all the time that you're doing as a family, that can be a totally lovely family experience. I'd say that I would try to keep it to 4 plus, because we really underestimate how much the child understands. But one show here and there every once in a while is really, it's not going to break their brain. And if they start to have like meltdowns, if they don't have this one thing, then that tells you that like this thing is really affecting them. And so, you can just stop. A couple things that I would recommend in terms of tips with screens is not to do it on routine. When things are routine, they become habitual, they can become expected. And when the child expects something, it they get upset when the expected thing doesn't happen. So I wouldn't do, if you were to like start watching a movie or something with your 5-year-old or 4-year-old every Friday night, I wouldn't do it every Friday night. I would do it like a Friday night. And then, 2 weeks later, maybe do it on a Saturday. And then 4 weeks after that, maybe do like a Sunday morning thing. It's really about not having it be a predictable thing, so that the child doesn't anchor on this, that it just is this fun thing that we did every once in a while. Kind of like, ice cream. It's just sort of this fun thing. And we enjoyed it and it was great. But it was, ultimately, it was just sort of a fun little thing. And nobody knew it was coming except for we invited you. And that was really great. But I think that games become sort of pulling them into this other world, which is taking them away, right? It's still time spent. It's time that could have been spent with family, or reading a book, or having a book being read to, or learning a board game, or playing outside, or talking about your feelings, or doing art. So I think developmentally, there's so much better things the child could be doing with them. And I think that there is some flexibility for really intentional programming for the child as they get closer to that 6-year-old mark. And then in elementary school, really knowing that there's a lot more flexibility that they kind of understand. But I would still utilize websites like Common Sense Media to check about the age range, because, when I was preschool, kindergarten, I had 4-year-olds who would come home and say that they watched the new Star Wars, which is really surprising, or young elementary kids who've watched the Harry Potter series. If you go on Common Sense Media, or a website like that can tell you developmentally like where people are at in terms of the actual expectation of age for this media, it's surprising. Sometimes it says, 9 plus or 12 plus, and you're showing it to a 6-year-old. There's going to be a lot of things that they're not understanding. And I would really go based on those guidelines, because I think that they're right. They have their own guidelines, and then they have what kids say and what adults say. So that can be really helpful to understand about kind of media choices that you might pick. And even in elementary years, I would keep with that unpredictability, that it's not an every single time thing. But they also will, if you do a Friday movie night, and then there's one night that you don't do it, the elementary age child is going to be able to handle that dissonance better than an under 6 child. So it's a lot more flexible. And then some families do need a device for communication, which I totally get. And I would just be really, really mindful about, the contacts, the internet access, and the actual game use for that child, because it's still time spent. And so we want to be really mindful of what could they have been doing with their time, and how can we support them with a balance? Because as they get older, they're probably going to be interacting with a screen. And so how do we not just expect them not to, but how do we actually empower them with being able to decide, oh, this is a good time to turn this off, or I'm learning my habits and I can change them. Well, that was a long question. I love talking about screens, and screen free, and supporting families with what to do. I will say the first movie that we ever showed my kids was My Neighbor Totoro. And it's a fabulous first movie. We watched it when my daughter was, I think we did our first movie at 5 or 6. And it's slow paced. It's the perfect movie in so many ways, but they did sort of like painted backgrounds, but then just the characters moving. So it's just really easy to follow for an early elementary sort of foray into movies. Well, that's it. That's our Friday 5. Thanks so much for joining me, and join me next week to talk about one Montessori toy, a non-Montessori toy, a practical life idea, a book, and of course, a parent question.